Hi, everyone. We're just going to give it a couple more minutes for people to connect. All right, looks like we have a bunch of folks joining. Can everyone see my screen?
Yeah.
Great. All right, welcome everyone. All right, looks like everyone can see my screen. All right, welcome everyone. My name is Angela Giacchetti. I am the OMS Member Engagement Manager. I'm just sharing my screen now, but I'm going to go ahead and kick it off to Yasha to get us started here.
Thanks so much, Angela. And hello, everybody. I am Yasha Franklin Hodge. I'm the Executive Director of the Open Mobility Foundation. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. It's great to see so many folks here, and I think some new names that I don't recognize. So I'm looking forward to getting a chance to chat with all of you. Before we get started, a couple of quick housekeeping things. We've structured this as a meeting rather than as a webinar on Zoom, just so that we can make it a little bit more interactive. We're going to have Q&A at the end. We want folks to chat. But please keep yourself muted when you're not talking, just so that we can keep the presentation flowing. I'd also ask that everyone rename themselves in Zoom to include your organization name. You can do this if you open if you click the participants button at the bottom of the Zoom window, find your name, which will be at the top of the list, and then under the More menu, there is a rename option. And I think there's a request for the Zoom meeting link. I'm guessing some folks are looking at this in Eventbrite, so we can share the direct link if folks want to load it in Zoom. But when you click your name, you'll be able to rename yourself, just so we can see. Thank you all who are doing that as we speak. Feel free to use the chat, react, ask questions, share a perspective. We're going to save the official Q&A for the end of the slides, but we're going to try to keep the chat as an active channel during the presentation. And lastly, we are recording the session, so this is going to be available to folks on request. So if you have colleagues or anyone else who needs to see this, feel free to reach out to us, and we'd be happy to share the recording with you. So with that, hold on one second. Angela, do you want to go to the next slide? All right, so here's what we're going to be covering today. We're going to start by talking a little bit about the OMF's open source model and how we work, who we are, why we exist. I think there's some familiar faces here, but we may be new to some of you, so want to give a quick introduction. Then we're going to talk about why work in the digital domain at the Curb at all. I know many of you are already doing work that is Curb related and data related, but we're going to sort of share our perspective on why this matters and how we think this can work and deliver value for cities and companies alike. Then we're going to talk about the Curb Data Specification. This is our soon-to-be launched data specification for exchanging digital information at the curb. And so we're going to get into a little bit of the details about what it does, how it works, and then we're going to talk about what's coming next, how we're going to roll this out, and the different ways that you can get involved in working with CDS or working with us as the OMF. So without further ado, can we go to the next slide? So I want to start by just framing the challenge that the OMF sees in the world that we are trying to help address. You can go to the next slide. We've spent much of the automobile era managing public rights of way primarily through physical infrastructure, whether that's signs or enforcement or parking meters. We've relied on activities and things in the built environment to help guide what happens on public streets, to ensure that they're serving their mission, that they're delivering public value. Next slide. But we're now entering this era where more and more of what happens on public streets is determined not just by individual people, drivers, pedestrians making a choice, but it's determined by algorithms and by digital systems that are shaping our public space and our public streets. These are algorithms that are used by ride-hail companies to decide what incentives to offer drivers to be in a given place at a given time. These are the algorithms that power autonomous systems and robots, whether they run on the sidewalk or the street. Algorithms that are increasingly shaping how deliveries get done with more automated routing and dispatch systems. Even the algorithms that we use for basic routing, when we drive around with Waze, they can save us a few minutes or help make our trip easier. But sometimes that can come at the cost of diverting traffic down off an arterial and down a residential street. Now, I don't say this or use these examples to say that these things are bad. In fact, I think these kinds of technologies and these tools are incredibly important for cities and exciting for cities and have the potential to do a lot of great things. But the challenge for local government is how they integrate all of these digital systems and digitally native services in a way that actually delivers on the public good and what the public actually needs to see. You can go to the next slide. So this is kind of at the core of the OMF's mission. We are really trying to build digital infrastructure that can help cities manage public space for public good. So this is, really for us, it's about building data standards and open source tools that cities can use to start to exchange data between private mobility companies that are operating services or engaging in activities on the public streets, often driven by algorithms and digital systems. They can start to interface digitally with regulators. They can get digital representations of regulations, and they can share data back with the folks who are charged with managing public streets to give them more insight and tools that they need to achieve the sort of public policy goals that cities set out to achieve. We're structured as a public-private collaboration. We think it's really important if we're going to encourage the growth of new mobility and new mobility services and technology on public streets. We think it's really important that there be both public and private sector at the table, and so that is core to our model. We also think there's a lot we don't know. We as the OMF, but also within our sectors and our silos, there's a lot of learning that we all have to do together. And so we work as an organization to try to build relationships between public and private sector to help them interface with one another in ways that ultimately leads to shared learning and hopefully shared understanding as technology evolves. Next slide. So our model is built as a nonprofit open source foundation. If you come out of the tech world, you'll be very familiar with some of the larger open source organizations that have been around for a long time. But fundamentally, our goal is to create common standards for digital governance And we want to do it in a way that actively supports the creation of a healthy business ecosystem around those standards. This isn't about replacing vendors or consultants. It's about creating a common language that can be used to interface the different components of a digital system, and then support the people who are building useful tools and technologies on top of those, that platform of common language. Next slide. So we're a membership organization. This is not a complete list of all of our members, but this is a snapshot of some of the folks. We have about 50 members in total. About 3/4 of them are public sector agencies, and the remaining quarter are private sector companies, a mix of technology providers and folks who operate services on public streets. You can see the full list of our members at that URL above. And next slide. Our model is, as we said, it's open source. And so we have lots of different stakeholders at the table: local government, Curb users, tech and service providers, all are contributing to the work that we're doing. We're building the tools through collaboration and shared participation. Everything we do is on GitHub. It's open for anyone to see. Our working group meetings are open for anyone to attend. The governance of our organization is what our members get to participate in, but anyone can come and make a technical contribution or share a perspective within the working group. And we think this model creates more competitive marketplaces, both for technology services, but also for mobility services themselves. We really want to see a world where cities have lots of choice when they're buying, and companies that want to bring something new and interesting to market can easily plug into the existing digital infrastructure that may be influencing the service in which they're trying to build. We also do a lot of collaboration with other open source projects. One of the nice things about being a nonprofit and an open source organization is it really lowers the bar or the barriers for collaboration with other projects. Now, you may, if you're familiar with us, you may know us more about the mobility data specification. So this is the thing that we have been working on since our founding. We are going to be working, and we've been working on this for the last couple of years. It's very much focused on, historically on micromobility, but we're in the process of expanding it to support other modes. We're not going to talk a lot about MDS today. We're not going to talk at all about MDS today, actually. We're going to talk about our new initiative, which is the Curb Data Specification, coming early next year. But if you're interested in learning more, we have a lot of information about MDS on our website, and we're always happy to talk, so please feel free to reach out. And now I am going to hand it over to Tom McGuire from SFMTA. Tom is a member of the OMF board. And he and his team have been significant contributors to the Curb work and really helping to shape the thinking around it, on top of the great work that SFMTA has done to think about how they want to use and develop their Curb. So Tom is going to talk a little bit about the big picture, the why of all of this, and then we'll have some other folks share more of the technical details about what we're doing. So Tom, do you want to take it away?
Okay, thank you, Yasha. And can you hear me okay?
We can. You sound great.
Excellent. Okay, well, thank you for the opportunity to speak to you all today. I'm Tom McGuire. I'm the Streets Director at the San Francisco Municipal Transportation Agency, board member at OMF and one of the founding cities. We see a lot of potential for this open source approach to setting standards specifically for curb management. The call for this work came from the cities who have been desperate for some kind of data standard for years to enable the innovative things we want to do with managing our curbs. We know that the demand for new modes of travel that can be best regulated not with metal signs but with more technology approaches it's been growing for years, and the pandemic has in many ways accelerated the growth of that demand. Standards-based approach is best for cities because it helps us share knowledge across cities. So many of the cities who are on OMF have been working together for years to create innovation in many parts of the street space, from new design standards for things like bike lanes to the mobility data spec. And so it's a natural thing that we would want to collaborate and set standards for how we manage the curb. It also helps us create an ecosystem or a procurement environment, a way in which some of the great private sector partners who I see on this call and some of whose names you see on the slide here can plug in a really structured way. We'd love for this to be a toolkit that traffic and engineering consultants bring to us as cities. We'd love for there to be payment providers and other folks who innovate in bringing in shippers and receivers into the ecosystem. We've been working on this for over a year. Dozens of public agencies and companies have already participated in some of the development we've done with the Curb Data Standard, and many of us are preparing to use it in the year ahead in 2022. This is a succinct statement of our goals. We want a standard that will give us the tools we need to deliver more value, and delivering value is something that the definition of that has changed even in the last year, from the growth of TNCs earlier in the previous decade, to the growth of micromobility, bike share, scooter share, to DoorDash and all the pickup drop off, both inbound and outbound delivery taking place at our streets. We know there are changing usage patterns, and we want to encourage those services, but we want to encourage them and price them and regulate them in ways that protects the public good. And we see a great role for both public and private sector in doing that. So on the next slide, we talk about how a curb data spec would benefit the overall ecosystem. Again, urban curb space, I don't think anybody in this on this call would disagree with the idea that it is a scarce resource. We get more value for the public, we get more value for ourselves as regulating agencies, and we get more value for the private sector partners who want to use the curb to provide new mobility models to our residents. If we have a standard language we can all talk about, streamlining communication between the regulator and user, targeting our enforcement better so that the regulations we put in place are actually enforced and real in the street, and then measuring what we're doing and unlocking new revenue opportunities, which is so important for cities right now. I think San Francisco is not alone among OMF cities in having pivoted towards some new things during the pandemic that have, on the one hand, supported the growth and the ability of the city to emerge stronger from the pandemic. I'm talking about on-street dining. We call them shared spaces here. They're called street seats in other cities. That's a really exciting thing. And it also puts an even greater squeeze on that scarce resource. And so one of the things that we in San Francisco and a lot of our peer cities are looking at is we know that new, more livable streets, more street dining uses of the curb are here to stay at some level. We also know the very same businesses that benefit from that now have an incentive to play ball with private sector providers and with the city in a regulatory environment that supports their inbound, outbound loading needs, supports the optimal use of the scarce curb space that is left after we convert so much of it to public use for dining. And we think that this is an especially good moment for us to be rolling out the kind of tools that really can only work if we have a data spec that we can all agree on and work from. So that's my perspective from San Francisco, and I think I'm speaking for a lot of cities within the OMF infrastructure, rather the OMF network. When I say we're really excited about Curb Data Spec and looking forward to the discussion today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tom. Really appreciate that perspective. You know, something that we're going to get into the details of the spec in just a minute, but you know, something I want to say for additional context on this is we've chosen as our initial area to work is to focus on commercial loading activity. Now that's a broad category. It covers a lot of different things. And you know, when we sat down with our steering committee members, our cities and our companies who are OMF members who really set our agenda, they identified this as a place where we could deliver and demonstrate the most value in the shortest time from the use of digital tools and the development of an open specification. So many of the things that Tom talked about, some of them relate to loading, some of them don't. Our long-term vision is that the tools we're building will apply to a lot of different curb uses and a lot of different curb contexts. But for your understanding, as we get into the technical details, know that a lot of what we're going to be starting off with has a commercial loading orientation. Now, with that, I think Michael is going to get more into the details of that scope, what that means, and where that goes. So, Michael, take it away. And I should say, Michael is our Director of Open Source Operations, who will be talking for much of the rest of the presentation.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and so my role is to sort of steward the group of volunteers from cities and commercial companies to develop the specification, to come to a mutual understanding on the details of the specification, that something that works for everybody and everyone can agree on. So for the Curb Data Specification, like Yasha said, we initially are focusing on commercial loading activities. There's a few reasons for this. Another reason is that when we're talking about figuring out what's happening at the curb, you need a certain set of ability to monitor the curb, sensors, people looking at it, something like that. And so by just focusing on commercial loading activities, we can focus that to a smaller scale than the entire city. So we're going to start there. We will expand CDS to cover the entire city in some capacity in the future. And so that's on the long-term roadmap. So for the short term, we're looking at things that happen at the curb around on-demand pickup and delivery, parcel delivery, different loading zones, passenger services, commercial or contractor loading, freight delivery, and food and beverage resupply. And these are the areas that the working group has focused on as the most important needs and the most dynamic use of the curb, and the parts of the curb where they will have sensors, or where we could potentially get data from the companies that are operating and using that curb as they use it, or historically after they use it. So next slide. So let's talk a little bit about the technical approach to CDS and what it actually entails. Next slide. So this is our base of the Curb Data Specification, which is digitizing some part of curb regulations. So cities have this in some capacity. Sometimes it's in people's minds, sometimes it's in spreadsheets, sometimes it's in GIS systems. But we want to take a subset of that for the short term, the commercial loading areas, and turn it into a sort of code, a digital representation of what those important commercial loading areas are, what the spaces potentially are within those, what the area around that is like. So all that can be defined with CDS, Curb Data Specification, so that we can focus on those specific areas geographically. What are the geographic areas, and what are the rules within those geographic areas around the curb? Next slide. So for the next part of CDS, we want to monitor what happens in those curb areas, and we want to track the events that happen. And this event tracking can happen through direct observation, through sensors above ground, in the ground, through cameras, through company data feeds. And really, we are trying to standardize the way that that cities capture all of that activity from different types of sensors, from different sources. And we want to bring that together in the CDS specification. So we have it's built to be very flexible. It can support all these different types of sensors, including, as I mentioned earlier, direct company data feeds, similar to MDS, if you're familiar with that. And those events come back to the city as they happen, and those get stored, and they can be analyzed over time, over space, and we can do a lot. Cities can do a lot with that information. Next slide. And where we can go with this is the third and final part of CDS. Where we can go with that event data is we can actually calculate metrics that are useful and used by many cities to determine things like curb productivity index. So how useful is this curb space? How is it being used? How can we change how we define the curb space, how it is physically structured, what the rules are there, to either increase or decrease usage of the curbs and serve more residents. So built into CDS is a metrics component as well, which has a way to take all the events coming in, standardize them, and turn them into the metrics you see below for the first version, which are total sessions at curb spaces, turnover rates, average dwell time, and percent occupancy as well. And so all of that is part of CDS. And so those three parts, the digital curb regulations, the curb events, and the curb metrics work together within CDS to come up with a holistic picture of what's happening at the curb and commercial loading areas. Next slide. So this all leads to what are the real world policy use cases for this. And we have a document on this. I think we'll get into it a little bit later. But the stakeholders are planning to use the Curb Data Specification to share publicly what the rules are and the locations of the curb spaces, which allows wayfinding, to share real-time curb status if that is available with sensors. So CDS does support that if cities do have those sorts of sensors in real time, and share that out. Also to analyze the curb usage, like I mentioned with metrics, respond to curb violations, and have a commercial curb inventory. And there's a number of other use cases as well that go beyond this that you can imagine if you have the information that we're putting together in CDS. So that's the technical high level, and I'll kick it back over to Yasha.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Michael. So if we can go to the next slide. So here's where we're at on this work. So we have a draft spec that is up on GitHub. We've been working since for just about a year now on this project. We started this effort off with the discovery phase where we looked at, we kind of did an examination of how cities are working on digitizing their curb and some of the other technologies that exist in the space already. We then moved on to an implementation phase where we've spent the last 6-7 months kind of designing and implementing the first beta version of Curb Data Specification. It is nearly done. We're expecting to release beta 1.0 in January. It will likely be a release candidate as it goes through the official OMF approval process, but we should have something for you all to start to work with very soon. For those of you who are technical and are feeling adventurous, here is the link to the current in chat to the current version of the beta development work, so you can start to understand the actual data structures and things like that. There's definitely going to be some changes. The working group has settled on some changes that haven't been rolled into GitHub yet, so don't start building any software to what you see in GitHub until we have that first release. But this will at least give you a little bit more of a technical insight into kind of exactly how all of this comes together. You can go to the next slide. So in addition to this technical work, one of the things that we're developing and we'll be releasing alongside the first version is a pilot project guide, really trying to gather information for cities and companies that are working on curb management pilot projects about how to do goal setting and planning, implementation strategies, how to do evaluation and measure whether the desired goals are achieved. We are very fortunate to have within the Curb working group at the OMF, a number of cities and companies who have been working on curb management, in some cases for many years, and who have done a lot of this kind of digitization, who have lessons learned about what works, what doesn't, how to put a program together. And so we tried to capture some of that wisdom in this document so that people who are starting out for the first time or just getting started on a project can take advantage of some of the things that our community has already learned and can hopefully accelerate the pace at which they're able to put their ideas for curb management into practice. Next slide. So for all of you, if this is interesting, there are ways that you can get involved in this. First, think about how you might actually use CDS in your work. I see a lot of different organizations represented here, cities and companies, and many of them are already doing curb projects, but think about how something like Curb Data Specification might be relevant to you, and please stay tuned and follow along as we move towards a release next month. Also start to talk with your customers, with your team about how CDS might slot in. We're always sort of interested in both your exploration of this, but also the feedback that you have for us. And one way that you can become even more deeply involved is by participating in the working groups themselves. As I mentioned, our technical working groups are open to all. We'll paste these links in chat that you can sign up for the mailing list. We have bi-weekly meetings that we cover a range of issues. We also have presentations from some of our members about the work that they're doing. Of course, you have the GitHub link, so you can always take a look there and add, open an issue, make a suggestion. Lastly, we are a membership organization, and this work, all of our work, is driven by the priorities of our members, both commercial members and cities. So if this is exciting to you, if you are hoping to shape some of the technology that gets built around curb management, if you have ideas for where something like CDS should go in the future, we would love to have you join the OMF. We are, I think, a place where you'll be sitting with a really interesting mix of peers, and you'll have the opportunity to both build those relationships within that peer community and influence the direction of technical development in important ways. So I know we have many of our members on the call, or many of our steering committee members represented here. But we're always interested in talking to you if you are not currently part of the OMF and are interested in joining. So with that, this is how you can find us. I think we are going to just open it up for Q&A. Feel free, it's a relatively small group, so feel free to just use the raise hand feature in Zoom. If you don't see it, it's under the reactions button. There's a raise hand, and then we can call on you. You can also throw any specific questions you have in the chat if you prefer to ask that way, and we'll try to make sure that we tackle them. Any questions? Can't possibly have explained everything that clearly.
You can also feel free to use the chat if that's easier.
Okay, well, if nobody wants to be the one to speak up, oh, Matt, we have Matt from Drive Clean, Colorado.
Hi, yes. Firstly, this is awesome. Been diving deep into, curb regulations, and we're hoping to expand that here to Colorado. I'm curious of whether, kind of what the established metrics are looking at so far from existing pilot projects that have been run in terms of greenhouse gas emission reductions, air pollution reductions, how those types of things have been measured, and then also whether there's any data or anyone on the line can speak to the costs that have been involved in, outfitting cities with some of these technologies to track and, digitize the curb, whether there's certain levels of that.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll take my kind of quick answer on that, or attempt a quick answer on that, but then I'd also actually like to invite any of the members of our Curb Working Group Steering Committee, and I know there are a number of you on the line who I think have some direct experience with some of the questions that just got asked. So Curb Data Specification is not explicitly focused on, kind of trying to measure emissions at the curb or emissions generally. But one of the things that it facilitates is management strategies that are emission or powertrain focused. So I know that there are a couple of cities, Los Angeles and Santa Monica, who are working on zero emissions delivery zones, so dedicated curb space for delivery vehicles, zero local emissions delivery vehicles. And something like Curb Data Specification offers a really useful tool to both publish those regulations when those spaces are established and to start to capture data using various tools, whether that's sensors or direct reported data from users of the curb to understand how and where those spaces are being utilized. So I would say that CDS as a specification fits in as part of, as a tool, as a key tool in helping to, address places and spaces where there are, there's a desire to have shift the emissions profile of curb usage. We also see there's a number of cities, Seattle and New York, that have are experimenting with alternative vehicle types like cargo bikes for deliveries. And CDS may play a role in that to the extent that those vehicles are accessing and using the curb, or that curb space is reserved for them, really trying to get a better understanding of the profile of who's using what spaces. I don't have a great answer for you on specific costs. We're building a toolkit, and I think as it starts to get adopted more, we're going to be able to see what kinds of cost models and service models evolve around it. There may be some folks from our steering committee, though, who have run actual projects who could comment on that, or who may have some thoughts on the emissions question as well. So I will stop for a second and see if Brian Hamlin or anybody else wants to on our steering committee wants to jump in with their thoughts on the answer to that question.
I can jump in there just really quickly. Hey all, Brian Hamlin from Seattle DOT. I'm also on the steering committee and acting as the steering committee chair as well for CDS. But yeah, so from Seattle's perspective on the zero emissions project, like something we see that would be really useful for CDS, and it's just like Yasha said, is we want to be able to identify where these zones are that we would like to have zero emission or low emission vehicles going to, and be able to digitally communicate, okay, this is where you should go. This is where you have your prime access at the curb, whatever that program ends up looking like. We can digitally connect the two and make it a lot more seamless to try to make that connection better than it currently is, which is just circling around and praying that you find something. So first and foremost, like that's one of the big ones. But then with the data that will be provided either through, cargo bikes or low emission vehicles, pick your medium there, we'll be able to determine what the metrics are from that. We can go through and then analyze. We get a few months worth of data. We can see how many vehicles are using those zones at the curb. We can see what the dwell times are, what the occupancy percentages are, and it'll be in that common data standard, which is going to be a huge benefit for everybody within the agency. So I think that's really what we're seeing right now as the zero emission benefits, and there'll be other things that come up over time. And as far as costs go, like I can't necessarily speak to that just because in Seattle we've had our curb regulations being recorded in a robust way for many years now. But working through the steering committee, and other folks can jump on here as well, you can really pick a really robust asset management system and dive into it and get every little bit of information from your sign records or whatever you want. Or we've discovered through different types of third-party vendors where you can go out with a camera and just start either automatically tracking every single sign and developing your curb regulations that are in like a CDS compliant format, hopefully down the road. So there's different options. You can do a really, really robust kind of expensive one like Seattle has, or you can work with something that's a little bit more flexible and lighter to develop a quick regulatory landscape of your city as well. They all have different costs, of course, but there's quite a few options out there.
And I could speak to these questions from a technical perspective in CDS. So from the environmental or vehicle type perspective, we do have the ability to specify the propulsion type of vehicles, and that can come through in both your policy definitions around the curb and in the events that come in the curb, and even through into the metrics, the vehicle type and some properties there. So that ability to track it is there in some capacity. And then the other part of it for the expense, we built CDS to be very flexible. So you can choose to use any or all parts of it. And you, even with some of the parts, you can choose to have the part be a dynamic thing that a server is required for, that you have to serve up, and it sends data back and forth as requested. Or you can, in many ways, many times you can just serve it up as a static file. So, depending on the sensor arrays you have, if you have any at all, and depending on your IT departments and vendors for help with that, you could go very bare bones and not have any servers and just host static files and still get some benefit, all the way up to a very dynamic system that would probably be costly, but might meet your needs.
Thank you, Brian and Michael, for that great perspective. We've got another question in the chat from Prem asking about the need for developing tools, which I'm reading to mean tools related to CDS, and if so, what kinds of tools would help the community, and what are our plans for building those? So if I'm understanding the question correctly, I think that there's certainly some amount of tooling that's going to need to exist at a low level of data validation and tools to convert from an existing asset management system into CDS, data translation tools, that sort of thing. But I think more broadly, there's actually a really interesting set of business opportunities here that we don't know exactly what they're going to look like or what the technologies are going to look like. There are companies now, some of them are OMF members, that already provide really excellent software suites to help cities more dynamically manage their curb, whether that's allowing for reservation of spaces or different pricing models for curb users. There are tools that exist and that maybe can benefit from additional data for doing curb space analysis and understanding how curb is allocated in a neighborhood or on a street, and comparing that with measured demand to understand where there may be a mismatch between curb need and existing curb use. There's going to be, I think there's a really interesting and robust ecosystem of companies right now that are developing technologies to measure what's happening at the curb, whether that's using cameras and computer vision or using sensors embedded in the roadway. We also think there's going to be some really great partnership opportunities that exist between cities and companies where there's willingness to either voluntarily share data or where it becomes compulsory in the context of, for example, paid parking in commercial loading zones, which some cities have. For many companies, they don't want their drivers spending their time putting quarters in a meter. So establishing a more automated data sharing regime might facilitate payment for access to curb, but also access to data on the part of the city about how the curb is being used. So all of these, from our perspective, represent really interesting business opportunities. I think, I would be lying if I said we've got the ecosystem figured out. I think all of our cities and our companies who are members are working, on they're placing some really smart bets, and we're going to learn a lot in the coming years. And we hope that CDS will play a really integral role in helping us all learn together and helping the best ideas spread, making it possible for something that gets built and tried in one place to get adopted somewhere else, whether that's a policy, a technology, or a piece of software. So that's maybe a less specific answer than you might have been looking for, but I think all of it's to say we believe that a robust ecosystem of technologies, tools, and services are going to grow up and evolve around curb data specification. That's what's happened with the mobility data specification over the last several years. And we're excited to have folks like you all in the room to help us facilitate that development process. I'm going to hand Colleen's question over to Michael, because I think this is more on the technical side of, I know it will depend on the monitoring source, but if you have video feed, does the CDS have the ability to capture license plate numbers and use that for billing and invoicing? Michael, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so maybe just to clarify a little bit about what CDS is, it is a data specification, and we at the OMF are not building software or hardware tools on top of it as an organization. So we're leaving that up to the third parties, to the cities, to the people like you to build. But the spec itself does have some ability to capture pieces of information, and we specify what those could be, like vehicle identifiers that could be read off the side of a vehicle by a camera system that you may have. And that piece of data could be stored in CDS and sent along as an event that happens. The specific question about license plate numbers, we have gone back and forth on that, and there's actually an open question still about whether or not license plates numbers would be included or should be included or not. We do have the ability right now to say capture, like I said, identifiers on the outside of the vehicle that are not license plate numbers. That actually could probably be used for license plate numbers. We also have the ability to have like a permit ID for a specific vehicle or company that could be passed along. So that's another way to capture that and share that information. If, I think license plates, we'll see if it gets included or not. And if you have strong feelings, you can reach out to us and put some information or a comment on GitHub and the discussion areas. But yeah, so I don't know if that answers your question enough. And if you were thinking about other sorts of identifiers besides license plate numbers. Okay.
Great. So we had a couple of questions that folks submitted when they filled out their registration, and I think there's some here that are fairly similar to one another. This first question is really about how jurisdictions can who implement CDS can attain compliance from vehicle operators, especially those that are working across multiple jurisdictions. And the granularity by which, I'll take that question first, and there's another similar question later on. Right now, there's as Michael had said, there's different components of CDS. There is the ability to digitally publish regulations for curb loading areas. There's also a standardized way to start to capture data about what's happening at the curb. I think this question about CDS compliance is for curb users is an interesting one, and one that, quite frankly, is not fully resolved. There are certainly, curb users for whom having clear access to data about where loading zones are, what rules apply, and having those data sets be available in a standardized digital format that can work across multiple jurisdictions, where that could be valuable, right? To have, there's a sort of little bit of a chicken and egg question, but when you get a certain critical mass of this data set being available for organizations that are using sophisticated routing and sequencing algorithms for deliveries, for example, knowing where the loading zones are and when they're available is potentially hugely useful to help streamline some of their operations. So we think there's value in cities publishing CDS data about where their loading zones are. It will probably take time before companies start to fully integrate that into their operational models. But if nothing else, it becomes it's a useful internal tool for cities to have that data captured and standardized, and allows for analysis of that data. In terms of companies reporting where their vehicles are using CDS, this is probably one of the biggest open questions in curb management right now. I think one of the avenues by which this may happen is as I mentioned earlier, this idea of like paying for access to a loading zone. If you have a pay-by-plate system, or even just a regular, traditional meter system for loading zones, providing a digital reporting mechanism, which CDS is, may offer enough value for companies to do that on their own. There are cities that are experimenting with sort of, kind of carrots that might incentivize better data sharing from private sector curb users. Things like designated spaces for certain activities that could improve the operational efficiency of certain locations. There are also, I think, potentially places and contexts in which there might be a regulatory mandate for data sharing that exists in other parts of the mobility world. You could imagine, for example, an airport insisting on access to data about use of its curb and having, well, they already do in many cases, have clear legal authority to do that. There are other sort of jurisdictional specific contexts in which cities might incorporate a requirement for some level of data sharing. So all of which is to say, I think this is a somewhat unanswered or unsettled question at this point. We know a lot of cities are experimenting both with publishing their data about curb regulations and trying to get data back directly from curb users. But while that is not the norm, we're seeing a lot of proliferation of tools and technology that can allow cities to capture data about what's happening at the curb using sensors and cameras, irrespective of whether data is shared directly from companies. So all of this is an evolving area, and it remains to be seen how it's going to shake out from a legal and policy framework. But we're trying to create very flexible tools that can work in a lot of different contexts and a lot of different regulatory models. The second part of this question was about the granularity at which CDS regulations are most effective, block by block or space by space or certain linear feet. CDS is, really in the regulatory side of it, the curb zone side of it is sort of like how a city might digitize its regulations. It is intended to mirror the ways in which cities publish those regulations in the physical world. So you can designate specific spaces because in some cities spaces are demarcated, or some area spaces are demarcated. You can have particular zones, you can have block level regulations. The model that we have is quite flexible, and it's intended to work in whatever, to reflect digitally whatever is the kind of regulatory context in the real world. What is most effective in terms of from a policy perspective, I think varies a lot from place to place. People have certain cultural expectations in one city to the next about how curb regs are going to work. And there's different built environments in different contexts. What makes sense in Midtown Manhattan may need a different strategy than what makes sense in a more suburban part of Denver, let's say. So I think all of that is up to ultimately the cities and the regulators to decide how they want to do this. But we're trying to build a flexible toolkit for them. I think we touched on a lot of this. So I think, hopefully we provided some good information that gets at the answer to some of these other questions. I'm hard pressed to answer any of the rest of these without kind of, follow-ups. So we'll spare you that process. But I think we've tried to give a good overview of what this is, what we're hoping it can achieve. I think as you can see from the folks who are on the call, many, if not all of the cities that you see on the call are actively involved in the development of CDS. We have, tremendous momentum from our, I think we're 40 something city members at this point who are really excited to coalesce around this as a standard and as a shared tool. But it's ultimately going to be up to the full ecosystem, not just cities, but companies as well, to help make this something that can be a foundational layer that supports, really the switch from curb management as a experimental idea to something that's a core part of how cities manage their public rights of way, manage their curb, and deliver value from that curb. So this has been a taste of what we're working on. Look for the first version to come out early next year. And in the meantime, don't hesitate to get in touch with us at the OMF. We're happy to answer follow-up questions. We're happy to share the recording of this. And we'd love to get you involved. Join the mailing list. There's a sign-up link in the chat, and come to a working group meeting. But we'd love your expertise and your insight in the room, and appreciate you all making time today to learn about this.
Great, thanks so much. I will, just to reiterate, I shared this in chat as well, but I'll send an email to all of you with the slide deck and some key links that were shared in the chat as well, so that you can share that with your colleagues. And you'll also have my email address if you have any follow-up questions or would like the recording. So thank you so much. All right, everybody. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Thanks for joining.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.